The hegemony scientific conclave met once every solar cycle on the neutral station hovering at the edge of the Andromeda Milky Way bridge, which was a polite way of saying it existed in the middle of absolutely nowhere, so that no single species could claim home field advantage. Approximately 700 of the galaxy's finest minds had gathered to discuss breakthroughs in theoretical physics, practical applications of exotic matter, and most importantly, who had the biggest metaphorical brain in the room. This year's conclave had a special attraction. The humans were presenting something. The human, those peculiar bipedal mammals who had stumbled into faster-than-light travel roughly 60 years ago, through what most established civilizations could only describe as a combination of stubbornness, caffeine, and what appeared to be deliberate ignorance of several fundamental laws of physics. They had shown up to the galactic community like a dinner guest arriving 3 hours late with gas station snacks, completely unaware that everyone else had been preparing hors d'oeuvres for millennia. The main auditorium stretched across 3 artificial gravity planes, allowing species of various orientations to observe the proceedings in their preferred directional comfort. The Etheron delegation floated in manufactured methane clouds near the ceiling. The BeamThe occupied the western wall, their crystalline bodies refracting the ambient light into small rainbows. The Horvath collective had claimed the traditional floor space, their insectoid forms arranged in precise mathematical patterns that probably meant something philosophical. And there, in the center of the presentation platform, stood the human delegation's equipment. It looked like someone had welded a refrigerator to a plasma coil and hoped for the best. Professor Wrynn of the Etheron Institute for Advanced Gravitonics regarded the human contraption with the sort of expression that suggested he had just discovered something unfortunate on the bottom of his shoe, assuming he had feet, which he did not. Wrynn was a leading expert in graviton manipulation, having published over 300 papers on the subject across his 200-year career. He had witnessed the development of the graviton beam from theoretical impossibility to practical weapon, and he knew with absolute certainty that there existed no shield technology capable of deflecting such weaponry. The humans claimed other. Ladies, gentlemen, and respected non-binary entities, announced the human delegation lead, a compact woman with graying hair and the sort of tired eyes that suggested she had spent far too many hours explaining basic concepts to people who should know better. We present the Adaptive Response Field Generator, Mark 7. A defensive system capable of countering directed graviton-based weapons. The auditorium filled with the various species-specific sounds of polite skepticism. The BeamThe chimed like distant bells. The Horvath clicked their mandibles in rhythmic patterns. The Etherons simply shifted their gaseous forms in ways that somehow conveyed doubt. Wrynn allowed himself to drift forward slightly, his translucent form rippling with what might have been amusement. "Forgive my directness," he said, his voice emanating from a small translation device that floated near his central mass. But this claim contradicts approximately 4 centuries of established physics. Graviton beams manipulate space-time itself at the quantum level. They do not interact with electromagnetic fields. They cannot be deflected by particle barriers. They phase through conventional matter as if it does not exist because at the moment of impact, from their reference frame, it functionally does not. The human woman smiled thinly. "We are aware of the conventional understanding, Professor." "The conventional understanding," Wrynn continued, warming to his subject the way academics do, when they sense an opportunity to be technically correct. "The best kind of correct is not merely conventional. It is observed, tested, and verified across every known species that has achieved graviton manipulation. The Horvath spent 80 years attempting to develop graviton shielding. The BeamThe calculated it mathematically impossible. Even the precursor artifacts we have discovered contain no evidence of such technology, and they were manipulating space-time when our respective species were still figuring out fire." A Horvath scientist in the front row raised one crystalline appendage. "The energy requirements alone would be prohibitive. To counter graviton-level space-time manipulation, you would need to generate an equal and opposite gravitational field at quantum scales. The power consumption would exceed the output of a small star." The human delegation lead glanced at her datapad. "Our generator operates on approximately 47 petawatts during active deflection." The auditorium went silent in that special way that indicated everyone was simultaneously checking their translation devices to ensure they had heard correctly. "That is," Wrynn said slowly, "several orders of magnitude below theoretical minimum requirement." "Yes," the human agreed pleasantly. "That is impossible. Yet here we are. Wrynn cycled through several colors that his species used to indicate varying levels of professional irritation. I do not doubt your sincerity, merely your methodology. Perhaps there has been a miscalculation, an error in your energy readings, or a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes graviton-level manipulation versus conventional particle beams. We are aware of the difference, Professor. We have been on the receiving end of graviton weapons 3 times, actually. Our colony on Proxima Station learned very quickly that traditional shields are decorative at best when someone fires a graviton beam at them. This much was true, and every species present knew it. Humanity's first encounter with graviton weaponry had occurred during a territorial dispute with a particularly aggressive Horvath fringe colony. The humans had lost an entire station in approximately 4 seconds. The second encounter involved pirates. The third was officially classified as a training accident, though rumors suggested it was actually an extremely unofficial field test conducted by a human military faction that wanted data and had flexible ethics. The important point was that humans had practical, painful experience with graviton weapons. They knew what they did, they knew how they worked, and they knew that shields did not stop them, which made their claim all the more baffling. Very well, Wrynn said, and now his form had settled into a deep purple that indicated he had moved past irritation into academic challenge mode. I propose a practical demonstration. I have brought a portable graviton emitter strictly regulated and licensed, naturally capable of producing a focused beam at 0.03 yotatons of graviton flux, more than sufficient to test any theoretical shielding. If your generator can deflect even a fraction of such a beam, I will personally endorse your findings before the entire conclave. The human woman's smile widened slightly. We accept. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. Suddenly this was not merely a presentation but a challenge. An old species versus a new one. Established physics versus unprecedented claims. The sort of moment that scientists lived for, even if they would never admit it at dinner parties. The equipment was arranged quickly. Wrynn's graviton emitter was a sleek device that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that advanced technology should also be aesthetically pleasing. The human shield generator looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage by a team that communicated exclusively through arguing. Between them, at the designated impact point, stood a standard test dummy made of sensor-laden composite materials designed to measure exotic energy interaction. And standing beside the human generator, checking readouts on a handheld device with the casual demeanor of someone performing routine maintenance, was the lieutenant. He was younger than the delegation lead, perhaps early 30s by human standards, with dark hair and the sort of face that suggested he found most situations vaguely amusing even when they probably should not be. He wore a standard Terran Defense Force uniform, completely unremarkable except for the small patch on his shoulder that indicated he belonged to the Applied Sciences Division, which was military speak for people who break things in interesting ways to see what happened. The lieutenant looked up, made eye contact with Wrynn, and offered a small nod that somehow managed to convey both respect and an awareness that he knew something the professor did not. Wrynn did not like that nod. It was the sort of nod that suggested upcoming inconvenience. Whenever you are ready, Professor, the human delegation lead said. Wrynn adjusted his emitter's focal point. Around the auditorium, various species leaned forward in their respective gravitational orientations. Recording devices activated. Bets were likely being placed in the back rows, though such behavior was officially discouraged at academic conferences. The lieutenant tapped something on his handheld device. The human shield generator hummed to life with a sound that suggested it was powering up against its will and would prefer to be somewhere else. Initiating graviton beam, Wrynn announced. 0.01% power for initial calibration. A line of distorted space extended from the emitter toward the test dummy. Reality bent along that line in ways that made most species' visual organs hurt. The beam struck the dummy and passed through it completely, leaving a perfect cylindrical channel where matter had briefly forgotten how to exist. Baseline established, Wrynn said. Now at full testing power, 0.03 yotatons. Firing in 3, 2, the lieutenant pressed a button, and everything the galactic scientific community thought it knew about graviton physics prepared to have a very bad day. Professor Wrynn had spent the better part of 2 centuries explaining graviton physics to students, colleagues, and occasionally military contractors who wanted to know if they could make bigger weapons. He had delivered the same lecture so many times that he could recite it in 12 different languages, including 2 that required bioluminescence rather than sound. The lecture went like this: gravitons are to gravity what photons are to light, except infinitely more complicated and significantly less inclined to behave predictably. They mediate gravitational force at the quantum level, which means they interact with space-time itself rather than merely existing within it. When you fire a graviton beam, you are not shooting particles through space. You are temporarily rewriting the fundamental geometry of reality along a specific vector. Matter does not block such a beam because matter is, from the beam's perspective, simply a suggestion that can be politely ignored. Therefore, shields cannot work. The physics forbid it. Any question? Usually there were no questions, because the math was unambiguous, and had been verified by every major civilization independently. The Horvath had tried to develop graviton deflection for their dreadnoughts, and concluded it was thermodynamically equivalent to preventing a black hole from being attractive. The Denderi had run quantum simulations for 60 years, and determined that graviton shielding would require technology that violated causality itself. Even the Aetheron, Wrynn's own species, had built their entire defensive doctrine around the assumption that graviton weapons were simply unblockable. You detected them, you evaded them, or you died. Those were the options. Humans apparently had not received the memo. The problem, the lieutenant said, conversationally as Wrynn's emitter powered up to full testing capacity, is that everyone approaches graviton deflection from the same direction. You try to match force with force, generate an opposing gravitational field, counter the space-time manipulation, fight physics with more physics. He adjusted something on the shield generator that made it whine in a higher pitch. That is, Wrynn said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child, because that is how physics functions. Force interactions follow established principles. You cannot simply decide to approach gravitational mechanics from a different direction, any more than you can decide to make water flow uphill through positive thinking. Water flows uphill all the time, the lieutenant replied. Trees do it constantly. Capillary action, surface tension. You just need the right conditions. That is not remotely equivalent to... I know it's not equivalent. I'm illustrating a point about assumptions. The lieutenant tapped his handheld device, and a holographic display materialized above it. When we first got hit by graviton weapons, our physicists had the same response everyone has. They tried to build bigger shields with more power, denser materials, exotic matter matrices, all the conventional approach. The hologram showed a series of failed experiments, each one ending with shields collapsing and test objects being reduced to their component atoms. Then someone in our applied sciences division asked a stupid question. What if we are thinking about this wrong? What if graviton beams are not unstoppable because they are strong, but because everyone is trying to stop them incorrectly? Wrynn's form rippled with colors that indicated professional skepticism trending toward outright dismissal. The fundamental mathematics are based on assumptions about how defenses should function. The lieutenant interrupted, which was generally considered rude in academic circles, but appeared to be standard human behavior. Every species in this room developed graviton technology after achieving a certain level of conventional physics mastery. You built on existing frameworks. Electromagnetic theory, quantum mechanics, relativity. You stacked graviton manipulation on top of those foundations. He gestured at the shield generator. Humans did not have those foundations. We stumbled into faster-than-light travel through what our scientists still describe as a fortunate accident, involving dark matter and someone misreading an equation. We barely understand half the technology we use. So when we started researching graviton deflection, we did not have centuries of proper methodology constraining us. We just had a problem and a willingness to try stupid solutions, until something worked. A Denderi scientist chimed a question that the translation system rendered as, "You developed breakthrough physics through incompetence." I prefer to call it unconstrained experimentation. But yes, essentially, the auditorium filled with the multilingual sound of scientific horror. Wrynn cycled through several colors rapidly, which was his species' equivalent of sputtering. That is not how discovery works. Physics is not a matter of trial and error. It is systematic analysis, theoretical modeling, experimental verification. Sure, if you have time. We did not have time. We had stations being destroyed.
The lieutenant's expression remained pleasant, but something harder flickered beneath it. When people are dying, you stop worrying about whether your methodology is elegant, and start worrying about whether it produces results. The human delegation lead stepped forward, her diplomatic instincts apparently sensing that the conversation was veering toward uncomfortable territory. What the lieutenant means is that our approach was necessarily pragmatic. We examined the problem from multiple angles, including some that conventional physics suggested were dead ends. Such as, Wrynn asked, biological systems. The silence that followed was the sort that indicated everyone was waiting for the punchline. You are claiming, Wrynn said slowly, that you developed graviton shielding based on biology. Partially, we also incorporated chaos mathematics, quantum foam manipulation, and some principles borrowed from our study of human neurological response patterns. She tapped her datapad and another hologram appeared. Our breakthrough came when a neuroscience researcher noticed that certain organic electromagnetic patterns showed unexpected resilience to graviton interference. Not blocking that remained impossible, but creating localized perturbations that affected beam coherence. The hologram displayed something that looked like a brain scan overlaid with graviton flux reading. We realized that graviton beams, while incredibly powerful, maintain coherence through quantum entanglement across the beam's length. If you could introduce controlled decoherence at the quantum level, not through opposing force, but through what we term induced quantum noise, you could disrupt the beam's ability to maintain its space-time manipulation. A Horvath scientist stood, mandibles clicking rapidly in agitation. That is absurd. Quantum decoherence at the scales required would demand energy expenditure far exceeding what conventional models predict. Yes, the human agreed, but conventional models assume you are trying to decohere the entire beam simultaneously. We are introducing cascading decoherence triggered by the beam's own energy. She smiled, and it was not a particularly nice smile. We are making the graviton beam interfere with itself. Wrynn's form went completely transparent, which was what happened when a Etheron encountered something that fundamentally violated their understanding of reality. Around the auditorium, similar reactions rippled through the assembled scientists. The denderi were chiming discordantly. The Horvath had stopped clicking entirely, which was never a good sign. The lieutenant, seemingly unbothered by the minor academic apocalypse he had triggered, checked his readings one final time. Professor, your emitter is at full charge. We are ready whenever you are. Wrynn slowly regained his color, settling into a deep crimson that indicated he had progressed beyond skepticism into active desire to prove someone wrong. Very well, if your theory is correct, your shield will introduce quantum decoherence and disrupt my beam. If your theory is incorrect, your test dummy will cease to exist in approximately 0.03 seconds. Those are certainly the two options. The lieutenant agreed. Final safety check, Wrynn announced to the auditorium. All recording equipment active. Sensor arrays calibrated, firing in 5 seconds. The human shield generator's hum increased in pitch and intensity, and now it sounded less like machinery, and more like something alive and not particularly happy about its current employment. 4 seconds. The lieutenant stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a scheduled transit, rather than a demonstration that would either revolutionize defensive physics or result in spectacular failure in front of 700 witnesses. 3 seconds. The test dummy stood motionless in its sensor harness, unaware that it was about to become either a footnote in scientific history or a very expensive piece of debris. 2 seconds. Wrynn's emitter reached peak power, reality already beginning to distort around its focal point in ways that made the ambient space look like it was experiencing technical difficulties. 1 second. The lieutenant pressed the activation button on his handheld device. Fire, and the graviton beam lanced forward into a wall of controlled quantum chaos that should not, by all established understanding, have been able to exist.
The graviton beam struck the human shield with the sort of inevitability usually reserved for celestial mechanics and tax collection. For approximately 0.003 seconds, everything proceeded exactly as Professor Wrynn expected. The beam began its fundamental interaction with space-time, reality warped along the designated vector, and the shield generator's energy field made contact with forces that should have ignored it completely. Then physics did something unprecedented. It hesitated. The graviton beam did not stop. Stopping was still impossible. The humans had not somehow repealed fundamental forces through sheer audacity, but it stuttered. The coherent line of warped spacetime that had been drilling toward the test dummy suddenly looked less like a precision instrument and more like a badly tuned video feed, flickering and distorting as if reality itself had developed packet law. Impossible, Wrynn said, which was quickly becoming his least favorite word. The sensor arrays positioned around the testing area went completely haywire. Numbers scrolled across displays faster than most species could process them. The Horvath scientists were chittering in rapid-fire bursts that the translation system struggled to keep pace with. A Dendari observer actually cracked slightly, which was their equivalent of fainting. The graviton beam was still there. Energy readings confirmed it was still propagating at full power, but it was no longer behaving like a graviton beam. It was wobbling. The quantum entanglement that should have maintained perfect coherence across its length was collapsing in cascading waves, each disruption triggering further disruptions in a chain reaction that fed on the beam's own energy. The lieutenant watched his readouts with the calm expression of someone who had seen this before and knew exactly how much strangeness was still incoming. Shield at 42% capacity. Quantum noise generator holding stable. Cascade pattern nominal. The test dummy, which by all rights should have been deleted from existence, remained stubbornly corporeal. The graviton beam reached it approximately 0.6 seconds after initial firing, far slower than it should have traveled, and when it made contact, something extraordinary happened. The beam's remaining coherent energy dispersed across the dummy's surface in a shower of harmless exotic particles, like water hitting a properly designed drainage system. The dummy's sensors registered the impact as roughly equivalent to a stiff breeze, a very expensive, physics-defying, theoretically impossible stiff breeze. The beam dissipated. The shield generator's hum decreased to idle levels. The lieutenant checked his handheld device one more time and nodded to himself. Apparently satisfied, 700 of the galaxy's finest scientific minds sat in absolute silence. Wrynn drifted forward, his form cycling through colors so rapidly that he looked like a malfunctioning mood ring. That is not... You did not block the beam. Correct. The human delegation lead confirmed. Blocking remains impossible. We redirected it. You cannot redirect a graviton beam. The mathematics explicitly state that you cannot redirect a coherent graviton beam through conventional force interactions. She interrupted. We did not use conventional force interactions. We introduced quantum-level noise patterns that disrupted the beam's entanglement coherence, causing it to decohere into non-directional graviton flux. Think of it as forcing the beam to forget which direction it was supposed to be going. A Horvath scientist stumbled forward on shaking legs, mandibles working soundlessly for several seconds before words emerged. The energy signature you are using the beam's own quantum properties against itself, creating interference patterns at scales that should not be achievable without. The human smiled. Without violating causality, we are not violating anything. We are exploiting a quirk in how graviton beams maintain coherence. Every species that developed graviton weapons optimized for penetration and power. You made them very good at ignoring defenses. What you did not account for was that making something very good at ignoring defenses also makes it potentially vulnerable to having its own coherence disrupted if you approach the problem sideways. Sideways, Wrynn repeated flatly. You approached quantum graviton mechanics sideways. We approached it from every available angle until something worked. Yes, the lieutenant decided this was an appropriate moment to contribute. The biological component was actually the key. Human neurons maintain quantum coherence, cross synaptic gaps through mechanisms we still do not entirely understand. We mapped those electromagnetic patterns and discovered they created micro-scale graviton interference as a side effect. Once we understood that, we could replicate it artificially and scale it up. He gestured at the shield generator with something approaching affection. This device generates a field that mimics approximately 40 billion human neurons firing in a specific pattern designed to maximize quantum noise at graviton-relevant scale. We are essentially creating a localized field of synthetic confusion that graviton beams cannot maintain coherence through. You weaponized confusion, a Denderi scientist chimed, and their tone suggested they could not decide whether to be horrified or impressed. We defensified confusion. Technically, the weaponization came later, but that is classified. Wrynn had progressed beyond color cycling into something that might have been an existential crisis. This will require complete re-evaluation of graviton physics. Decades of established theory still holds, the human delegation lead said firmly. Your physics is correct. Graviton beams do manipulate space-time. They are unblockable through conventional means. Everything you know remains true. We simply found an unconventional mean that nobody had tried before because it seemed absurd. It is absurd, and yet it functions. The auditorium erupted into chaos. Scientists of various species rushed forward to examine the equipment, demanding access to detailed specifications, arguing about theoretical implications, and in at least 3 cases apparently starting new research collaborations on the spot. The conclave's carefully maintained atmosphere of dignified academic discourse collapsed into what could only be described as a very sophisticated brawl over who got to study the human technology first. The lieutenant stepped back from the equipment to avoid being trampled by an enthusiastic group of Horvath researchers and found himself standing next to Wrynn, who was watching the chaos with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been gently but firmly demolished. I have spent 200 years studying graviton physics, Wrynn said quietly, and that knowledge is still valuable, the lieutenant replied. You understand how graviton beams work at a fundamental level. We just figured out how to make them not work. Different problems, different solutions. You broke physics. We bent it slightly. Physics is more flexible than most species give it credit for. Wrynn was silent for a long moment, watching as a Denderi scientist attempted to physically merge with the shield generator's control panel in their enthusiasm to understand its operating principles. Your species has been spacefaring for 60 years. We have been traveling the stars for over 4,000. How did you develop this before any of us? The lieutenant considered the question carefully. Because you are all much better at physics than we are. You understand the rules, you work within established framework, you build on foundations of proven theory. He paused. We do not understand the rules well enough to know which ones we are breaking, so we just try things and see what happens. Sometimes we accidentally discover something useful while trying to make something completely different. That is terrifying. I know, we terrify ourselves regularly. Around them, the scientific chaos continued to intensify. The human delegation lead was attempting to establish some sort of order by promising detailed technical briefings to interested parties, which only resulted in more interested parties appearing from every corner of the auditorium. Someone had already started a betting pool on how quickly various military organizations would attempt to reverse engineer the technology. A fight had broken out between 2 research teams over who had priority access to examination time. It was, by any objective measure, a complete disaster of academic protocol. It was also, Wrynn had to admit, the most exciting conclave in 3 centuries. The hegemony scientific conclave did not typically end with fistfights. But then again, the hegemony scientific conclave did not typically witness the complete overthrow of established physics by a species that had invented interstellar travel through what amounted to a very lucky guess, and some questionable mathematics. 3 hours after the demonstration, the auditorium had transformed into something resembling a very polite riot. Research teams from 17 different species had formed a queue to examine the human shield generator, which had immediately collapsed when 4 teams attempted to study it simultaneously. The Horvath delegation had started 3 separate academic feuds over interpretation of the sensor data. 2 Denderi scientists had actually fused together in their excitement, which was apparently something their species could do but chose not to discuss in mixed company. Professor Wrynn floated near the back of the auditorium, watching the chaos with the detached fascination of someone whose entire career had just been simultaneously validated and rendered partially obsolete. His life's work on graviton physics remained accurate. The humans had not somehow repealed quantum mechanics through stubbornness, but his certainty about what was possible had taken substantial damage. The lieutenant found him there holding 2 containers of what appeared to be coffee, though identifying human beverages by sight alone was an uncertain proposition at best. Thought you might need this, the lieutenant said, offering 1 container. Fair warning, it contains caffeine. I have no idea what caffeine does to gaseous species,
but I assume worst case it just passes through you. Wrynn accepted the container tentatively, more out of politeness than any expectation of consuming it. Your delegation lead is currently being mobbed by approximately 40 research teams demanding collaboration agreements. She expected that. We brought extra legal staff specifically for the post-demonstration contract negotiations. The lieutenant sipped his coffee. The real question is whether anyone will actually admit they want the technology. Pride makes species do funny things. The Horvath have already filed 3 requests. The Horvath have no pride, only enthusiasm. I was thinking more about civilizations with long-established Graviton weapons programs, who would have to explain to their militaries why the newcomer species solved a problem they claimed was unsolvable. Wrynn cycled to a rueful amber. You are describing my government specifically. I was trying to be diplomatic about it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as a Denderai scientist attempted to bribe a human technician with what appeared to be crystallized rare mineral. The technician was explaining with admirable patience that they could not simply hand over classified military technology in exchange for shiny rocks, regardless of their monetary value. I do not understand your species, Wrynn said finally. You approach everything backward. You lack proper theoretical foundations. You substitute chaos for methodology. By all reasonable standards, you should not be capable of meaningful scientific advancement. And yet here we are, making your Graviton beams sad. Here you are indeed. Wrynn paused. May I ask how you actually developed this technology? The true story, not the diplomatic version your delegation lead provided. The lieutenant grinned. The true story is somehow less impressive. We had a neurologist who was studying Graviton exposure effects on human brain tissue. She noticed that certain neural patterns showed unexpected resilience to Graviton interference, not because they were blocking anything, but because the electromagnetic noise from active neurons was creating micro-scale quantum disruption. She mentioned this at a bar to an engineer who was drunk enough to think it sounded like a good idea to try replicating artificially. Your breakthrough came from a bar conversation. Our best breakthroughs usually do. Alcohol makes humans stupid enough to try things that sober humans know are impossible. Then occasionally the stupid idea works and we have to reverse engineer. Wrynn made a sound that his translation device struggled to render, eventually settling on something between a laugh and a sigh of resignation. That is the most human thing I have ever heard. We contain multitudes, most of them inadvisable. Down on the presentation floor, the human delegation lead had apparently achieved some measure of control over the crowd by promising a detailed technical paper within the next standard month. This satisfied approximately nobody but at least reduced the immediate pressure from active mobbing to aggressive hovering. You realize, Wrynn said, that this changes everything. Every species with Graviton weapons will need to reconsider their defensive strategy. Every military doctrine built on the assumption that Graviton beams are unstoppable becomes obsolete. You have fundamentally altered the balance of power in this galaxy. We are aware. The lieutenant's expression turned more serious. We are also aware that makes us either very valuable allies or very dangerous threats, depending on perspective, which is why we are sharing the technology rather than hoarding it. Hard to shoot the species that just handed you the solution to your defensive vulnerability problem. Pragmatic. We are newcomers in a very old galaxy. Pragmatism is survival. A Horvath administrator approached, mandibles clicking in what the translation system identified as urgent request pattern. The lieutenant excused himself to handle whatever minor crisis had emerged, leaving Wrynn alone with his rapidly cooling coffee and his thoughts. The professor had spent 2 centuries believing he understood Graviton physics completely. He had published papers, mentored students, consulted on weapons development. He had been certain, absolutely certain, that Graviton shields were impossible. He had the mathematics to prove it. He had the experimental data. He had the consensus of every major scientific institution in the known galaxy. And then a species that barely understood their own technology had walked in and solved the unsolvable through a combination of biological accident, questionable methodology, and what could only be described as aggressive disregard for established scientific practice. It was humbling. It was also, Wrynn had to admit, absolutely hilarious. He allowed himself to cycle through several colors that indicated amusement, relief and the peculiar joy that came from discovering the universe was stranger than expected. Around him, the scientific community continued its enthusiastic dismantling of everything they thought they knew about defensive physics. New theories were already being formulated. Old assumptions were being questioned. The next decade of research had just been comprehensively disrupted by a species that had attended their first conclave barely 30 years ago. The humans had arrived late to the galactic community with technology they did not fully understand, theories they could not completely explain, and solutions to problems that everyone else had declared impossible. And somehow, improbably frustratingly, they kept being right. Wrynn looked down at the coffee container in his appendages, then at the chaos surrounding the human equipment, then back at the coffee. He attempted to drink it, discovered that he could not actually consume liquids in any conventional sense, and decided that this failure was somehow perfectly representative of the entire situation. The universe, it seemed, was full of problems that appeared unsolvable right up until someone too stubborn or too ignorant to know better found a solution. The humans specialized in being both. Down on the presentation floor, the lieutenant had returned to his equipment and was explaining something to a cluster of fascinated researchers. Even from this distance, Wrynn could see the human's expression, patient, amused, and carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew that established wisdom was always one good idea away from becoming historical footnote. Professor Wrynn cycled to a peaceful blue, accepted that his understanding of physics would need substantial revision, and went to join the queue of scientists waiting to ask questions about how the humans had broken his field. After all, if you could not beat them, you might as well learn from them. Even if their methodology was absolutely ridiculous,